Final Fantasy VII has perhaps the most iconic opening cutscene of all time, and it is an intro ripe with massive, exaggerated spectacle. It opens with a shot of the night sky, filled to the brim with seemingly endless stars shining like diamonds. Then the sky fades away to reveal a young woman. The camera pans out, revealing the woman's surroundings. We soon realize that for the first time ever, a Final Fantasy game will be taking place in an industrial world, rather than the traditional fantasy setting of the previous games. This alone would be intriguing, but the camera doesn't stop moving. It continues to reveal more and more of the city of Midgar, a city that only gets larger and more impressive with every second, as if to say, this is the power of the PlayStation. And then the music flares, and the game's logo eclipses the screen. The opening to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is far more restrained and understated, but just as effective. At first, there is nothing. Nothing but silence and darkness. Words written in a simple font appear on the screen, but before you can even finish reading them, a flash of light cuts through the darkness. You hear a voice, one you have never heard before, but immediately you recognize it.
Open your eyes.
Zelda. She's calling out to you, telling you to wake up. Link awakes in a pool of water, in a dark room with odd, almost futuristic architecture. He collects the latest iPhone before exiting the room, only to find himself in another one. It's small and dark, almost claustrophobic. You feel as if you should be suffocating, and this feeling is only exacerbated by the knowledge of the vast, beautiful open world you should be exploring. You discover some chests and open them to find bland, tattered clothing, a far cry from the iconic green tunic that has become the hallmark of the franchise, or the immaculate sky blue t-shirt from the game's trailers. You travel to the end of the tunnel and find a door. You open it and are immediately struck by the light of the outside world, blindingly juxtaposed to the darkness of the cave. You rush toward the light, finally exiting the cave, finally finding your freedom, and then Persona 5 is perhaps the perfect example of what makes a good opening so important. This may be my favorite game of all time, but even I have to admit, the first few hours are an absolute slog. Much like any modern RPG, the tutorial is several hours long, and the first few hours of cutscenes and dialogue are pretty underwhelming compared to the rest of the game. None of the flash or substance that Persona 5 is famous for appears in the first few hours. Now, I get why. If players are going to enjoy a game at all, they need to know how to play it, and the tedium and mundanity of the early cutscenes are necessary in order to create a juxtaposition between Hollywood actor Joaquin Phoenix's life before and after starring in Joker. That doesn't make it any less boring. Lesser developers would harm the story by cutting content or speeding up the narrative, but Atlas takes a different approach. The game doesn't start at the beginning. It starts at the climax and then flashes back. Sure, it's a bit cliche, but this tactic is so overused because it works. Instead of forcing the player to slog for hours before anything interesting happens, Persona 5 begins with a show of its greatest strength: its style. The game opens on this gorgeous, glowing, golden casino. You jump from chandelier to chandelier, staying just out of sight of those below, gambling away their children's college funds. You obliterate a monster 3 times your size, evade guards, jump through a gorgeous, stained glass window, and land in the clutches of Japan's police force. Look how many cops there are! That's at least 3. You get arrested, beaten, and interrogated, and it's during the interrogation that the flashback begins. The majority of the game takes place during this flashback, and you spend the entirety of it waiting for the other shoe to drop. Waiting to find out how the funny man from Smash Bros. Went from this, to this, to this. That is the hook that will drag you through the less interesting segments of the game. There seems to be a bit of a misconception in the gaming community. A lot of people seem to be under the impression that as long as the developers can convince people to buy the game, it doesn't really matter whether or not people actually play it. And yeah, sure, maybe in the 1980s that was true, but the age of the internet, the experience of early customers affects future sales more than anything. Literally anybody can post their opinion on the internet for the entire world to see, and millions of people do it every day. Hell, I'm doing it right now. More now than ever, video games are heavily reliant on gaining popularity by word of mouth. Mario Kart Wii, GTA 5, Breath of the Wild, these are some of the most popular and well-received games of all time, and what do they all have in common? Everybody was talking about them when they came out, and continued to do so for months after release. Hell, years later, people still talk about them. Everybody had something nice to say about these games. They were recommending them to anybody who would listen, and as a result, their popularity only grew. The opposite, of course, occurs when a game isn't so popular. If people don't enjoy a game, they'll take to the internet and make sure everybody knows it. If enough people share that opinion, the game sales will drop to next to nothing. It happened to Sonic Forces and Marvel's Avengers and Balan's Wonderworld, and a fourth example. And yeah, these games aren't exactly the cream of the crop, but I'd be willing to bet money that most people form their opinions before they even finish the first level. The trophy statistics sure seem to back that one up. The average human attention span is about 8 seconds long, and while I'm sure the $60 price tag might extend that attention span by quite a bit, if a game doesn't start out strong, a lot of people will lose interest, and they're gonna make that lack of interest extremely clear. And the people who actually stick around till the game gets good, they won't really have anything worth talking about until after everyone else has already moved on. First impressions matter. I think some of the best opening segments are the ones that perfectly capture a game's essence in just a few short minutes. For example, Undertale opens with some text and what appears to be cave paintings depicting the events of the war between humans and monsters. It's not exactly unique, but it is effective. It's also a lie, but that's kind of the point. Then you see a character climb a mountain and fall into a hole, truly the peak of visual storytelling. You see the title screen, boot up the game, name your character. I named mine Undertale to get the home field advantage, and then, hey, wait a second. This is just ripping off of Earthbound. You walk down a hallway and meet a friend. This is Flowey. He's a cute little flower who walks you through the game's mechanics and teaches you about the world of Undertale. In Undertale, you need to collect a substance called love. You do this by using your soul to collect little white friendliness pellets. Sure, it's a bit awkward and cringy, but come on. It's a kid's game. What did you expect? Eldritch abominations beyond comprehension? Look, Flowey's even gonna give you some friendliness pellets right now. Go get him, buddy, go get him. Oh! This intro is perfect because it encapsulates everything that makes Undertale. It behaves like a very traditional RPG designed specifically for children. It makes sure to set up as many cliché genre conventions as possible, only to immediately flip them all on their head. This is what Undertale does. It serves as both a criticism and a celebration of the history of video game storytelling. It's a game with a bright, cheery story full of much darker secrets. If it was a superhero show, it would be on Amazon Prime. And it makes sure the player knows all of this from the very beginning. This serves as a very powerful hook, and as anybody who did those dumbass Toastmaster speeches in elementary school knows, the hook is the most important part of any introduction. The second most important part is how funny you are. I've already lost, haven't I? So far, we've only really looked at story-based games, and for the most part, the opening segment was shaped almost entirely by the game's stories. But what happens when a game doesn't really have a story? I mean, without a story, you can't really rely on an opening cutscene. I mean, you can, but I am far from the first person to talk about this, but Super Mario Bros. 1-1 is perhaps the single greatest first level in video game history. Not because of how fun or creative it is, but because it is specifically designed to teach you how to play the game without any actual instruction. I mean, it literally teaches you how to jump. The empty first screen gives you space to experiment, to play with the D-pad and figure out what the A and B buttons do. This was a lot of people's first experience with platforming and even video games in general, making this experimentation a necessity for many. Mario's placement on the left side of the screen ensures the player knows to go to the right. The slowly approaching Goomba on the next screen forces the player to jump, which is especially helpful if they have yet to do so. And it teaches them that they can die if they fail to jump in time. The question marks on the blocks ensure the player knows that these objects are something that can be interacted with. For most players, the very fact that these blocks exist would lead to some form of interaction, but for those who mistake them for simple obstacles, the question marks are sure to lead to investigation. And the mushroom that comes out at the top rewards this investigation. Everything the player needs to know is here in the first few seconds of gameplay. For a game this simple, it is the perfect tutorial. Nintendo cracked the code on their first try and would continue to implement this strategy in every subsequent Super Mario Bros. Game, as well as the first Zelda, and the first Metroid, and the first Kid Icarus, and the first Kirby. Even other companies copied this strategy. Sonic, Mega Man, kind of. Even Crash Bandicoot did it 13 years later. It's truly the perfect opening level. For a while, the inevitable crossbreeding of video games and the internet had a largely positive effect on the quality of video games. The ability to play your favorite games with anyone in the entire world over the internet vastly improved the value and longevity of many beloved franchises. For the first time ever, developers were able to fix their games' issues post-launch with single updates, and entirely new genres of video games were created practically overnight. But it wasn't long before a terrible monster reared its ugly heads. Corporate greed. Paid DLC, in-app purchases, paywalls, gacha mechanics, and live service games began to seep into every aspect of the gaming world. With the advent of online gaming and digital stores built into the console, companies began brainstorming new ways to milk every penny out of the average gamer. In time, companies like Square Enix and Blizzard became overly reliant on these methods in order to turn any sort of profit. Their games simply take too long to produce and their reputations are in the gutter. That's why you see so many ads for Final Fantasy Online. It's a live service game, and at this point it's pretty much the only thing keeping Square Enix afloat in between the real Final Fantasy games. I mean, we all know it ain't Marvel's Avengers or Chocobo GP making them all that money. The problem with these methods of making money is that they're incredibly predatory, objectively immoral, and more often than not, these companies are exclusively targeting children. The other problem is that these methods are just completely unsustainable. It requires an insane amount of money and manpower to maintain these long-term games and continue to supply them with additional content. That's time, money, and effort that would be better spent making, real video games. In order to justify creating and maintaining them, these types of games absolutely have to turn a profit. In order to actually pull this off, players have to be given a legitimate reason to not only knowingly play an incomplete game full of in-app purchases, but to also continually spend money on the game for several years. In these games, more than any other, the opening hook is incredibly important. If Fallout 76 proved anything, it's that no amount of additional content will make a live service game profitable if everyone abandoned it on day one. A lot of the best openings are the ones that cause an obvious emotional reaction. The emotion causes them to be a lot more memorable. For example, funny ha-has. Waking up in that cart in Skyrim is so unintentionally hilarious that people are still making jokes about it over a decade later. The intro to Arcane's Prey works because it plays on fear. This is a horror game taking place on a decaying space station, but it starts in a pristine apartment overlooking a beautiful city. There's a cheerful and energetic atmosphere, but something is clearly off. The knowledge that this is a horror game and the feeling that something isn't quite right create an atmosphere of suspense. You're constantly waiting for that other shoe to drop, and when it finally does... Oh my god! This shit gets intense. Interestingly enough, another horror game, Five Nights at Freddy's, does the exact opposite. The first few minutes of the first night are taken up by a character known as Phone Guy. He talks to you, walks you through the opening of your night, drops a couple of hints and tidbits that can help you survive, and sort of brings an air of comfort to this empty, sort of terrifying Chuck E. Cheese. I don't know if this one really counts, but the intro to Super Mario 3D World just makes me so damn happy. It's so dumb and goofy. It's got a cartoony personality usually reserved for Mario spin-offs, and there's a bunch of cute little gags and references that just make my day. It's not really necessary because, Mario game, but I still appreciate the fact that it's here and all. The Metroid series is a franchise ripe with great openings, but my personal favorite is the opening for the original Metroid game. It starts out with this really sick establishing shot of a spacecraft, followed up by two shots that sort of say, yeah, that's right, she's a badass, before transitioning to first person for the first time in series history. The game then takes the time to showcase some of Samus's abilities. This happens to be the only Metroid game I've played where Samus starts out with a bunch of her abilities and upgrades, and automatically it makes you feel like a badass. You explore the ship a bit, fight some enemies, experience some high quality environmental storytelling, and then transition into one of the coolest early game boss fights I've ever been through. Then there's this really sick sequence where you have to escape a self-destructing ship before the clock hits 0, and right in the middle of this super intense sequence, Samus loses all of her abilities and runs into a fucking space dragon. Then you land on this super atmospheric forest planet with one goal in mind. Get back all of those badass power-ups from the intro so you can find that dumbass lizard and kick its ass. ass. I honestly don't know what part of this intro best serves as the hook. The fact that you used to be a total badass and can definitely get there again, the knowledge that sooner or later you get to shoot a dragon with a bunch of missiles, or the fact that Retro Studios managed to cram all of this cool shit into less than 20 minutes, all make really great hooks. Because like, if they can do this much cool stuff in just 20 minutes, imagine what they're gonna do with the next 14 hours. But I mean, if we're talking about pure coolness factor, nothing beats Sonic Unleashed. There's nothing particularly special or artsy about it, it's just cool as fuck, man. It's a fast-paced action sequence with missiles and explosions. There's some really cool shots of knockoff Goku and Eggman's ship. The animation is super high quality, especially compared to a lot of the other games that came out around this time. And there's a ton of personality in both Sonic and Eggman. I also think that this might be the best depiction of Eggman. Something about it just works. It's definitely a highlight in a game with a lot of highlights, and it kept me going through a lot of the game's many low points. You know, I spent so much time talking about beginnings that I don't really know how to end the video. Okay, bye!